Alrighty, guys, let's talk about fishing line. Let's talk about braid versus fluorocarbon versus monofilament. I'm going to tell you guys why I use braid for basically everything I do, and not even basically, it just that is what I use for everything I do. And I'm going to tell you guys the sizes I use, the liters that I use, and why that is. So let's start with the concept of just braid to leader in general. So I have experimented with all sorts of different lines on all sorts of different rods and reels, and I have come to the conclusion that for me and my fishing, now this is a very opinionated topic, and I'm probably on the minority. I feel like most people like to fish like traditional stuff like jigs and chatterbaits and all that kind of stuff on fluorocarbon. I am not one of those people, but I know that I'm also not the only person doing what I do. So what I do is I fish with braid for everything, and then I adjust accordingly. The first reason, the most prominent reason why I do that is because fishing is not my full-time occupation. This is not what I do all day, every single day. It is my hobby. So I have a handful of rods that I use, and I use them throughout the year. I don't have any interest in unspooling entire spools of fluorocarbon and respooling fresh fluorocarbon. I don't have any interest in treating my line. I don't have any interest in stretching out my line. I want to have my line on the reel that is going to do me until I'm out, and then I have to redo it. So braid is the best option for that. It's kind of a convenience factor. It's not going to go bad on your reel. You can use it for 2, 3 seasons as long as you are not cutting off too much line or unless you get a huge backlash, all that kind of stuff. It's very durable. That's my first reason. The second reason is hook set ability. So me being in a kayak primarily, if I'm fishing a bait like a chatterbait, right? Let me see if I can find a chatterbait real quick. If I'm fishing a bait like a chatterbait, right? So here we go. We got a chatterbait Evo here. This is a bait that has a pretty enormous hook. I think this is like a 5/0. This is like a flipping hook, right? It is a stout hook. And I don't like to throw chatterbaits on like a flipping rod. So I'm throwing this on a medium heavy rod. Well, a medium heavy rod with fluorocarbon in a kayak that is moving every time you do anything. If I am throwing out into 20 foot of water and I'm reeling that, chatterbait through and popping it through grass, and I get a 4 or 5 pounder that eats my chatterbait, and I'm maybe a little bit out of position because my kayak is drifting over or something like that, and I get a little half-hearted hook set, I'm telling you guys, you're not gonna set that thing. It's not gonna work. At least in my experience, it's every single time this happens to me. It just doesn't have the power. There's too much stretch. A lot of people will say, "Oh, fluorocarbon is clear, is like monofilament with no stretch." It doesn't have no stretch. It has less stretch, but it still has significant stretch, especially if you have a long cast out there. There's actually a ton of stretch. So you really, to get a good hook sound, something like that, you'd have to reel it down tight and really jack it home, which if you're on a bass boat is a lot more feasible. So I understand that if you're a bass boat fisherman, that's a lot more feasible to get a solid hook set. When you're in a kayak, you're fishing all sorts of different angles. The kayak's moving all the time. You lose a lot of your leverage when you're fishing, especially on like a lake in deeper water, as opposed to just like on the bank for a pond. So that is my first reason. And then the second reason is I love the response that I get from braid. So braid, because it's also not zero stretch. There's a little bit of stretch, but it's as low stretch as fishing line can get. Because of that, you get extremely sharp and immediate feedback from bites, stumps, like structures underwater, all that kind of stuff. You get immediate feedback, even from a less expensive rod. So with fluorocarbon, you have to really buy a high-end rod to get the sensitivity transmission through. Whereas with braid, you can be a guy that, like me, who has just budget rods, $150 rods, $100 rods, but that braid will transmit a lot more sensitivity to you at a lower rod price. So that is another reason. Those are really the main two reasons there. And then the last one is I just like the castability of braid. I've been fishing it for years and years and years. So I am just familiar with it. I know how to work it. I know how to try and not get backlashes. So I love how it doesn't. I love how it has low memory. It's just limp. I like when I go back and I fish like fluorocarbon or monofilament, just remembering all the spool, like the coils when you just slightly overcast it. For me, I'm just extremely comfortable with braid. And then along with all those other reasons, that's why I stick with it for everything. And then what I do though, because you might be saying that's crazy. You can't just tie braid to a jerk bait. You can't just tie braid to like these ultra finesse things. And you're right. And I think you can actually, you can still catch fish, but you really need to then implement a leader. So let's first, before we get into leaders, let's talk about the braid that I'm talking about. So there are different types of braid. And for the longest time, if you just want to, you want to have one recommendation and just forget about it, the easiest, cheapest one, just get Power Pro. Just go to Walmart and get Power Pro. I've been using that for years. It is trusty. It is great. There's no problems with it. It's very affordable. But if you're really into fishing, you fish a lot of braid, and you want to know kind of the rabbit hole there is a little bit of a rabbit hole. But so there's a few different ways you can go. So if you're someone who's talking about fishing braid for, stout rod, in the pads, you're fishing with frogs, you're flipping, all that kind of stuff, you're going to want to go with something like this. This is a Max Quattro. So the reason why this is still an expensive line, even though it still only has 4 threads woven in, is this is a very thin line. So it has 4 weaves, which, let me even talk about that. I haven't really talked about that. There are different ways to create braid. So the cheapest braids have only 4 threads that are woven together. The reason that they're cheaper is that it's less material and it's rougher on your guides, it's rougher on the grass, it's rougher on your reel, all that kind of stuff. It's louder. But the pros is that because it is a little bit more jagged, it cuts through grass a little better. So if you're fishing in grass and stuff that you need to cut through, then a 4-strand like Power Pro, or if you want to go a little thinner, Max Quattro, is going to be a great option for you because you can pull through. Now, if you're fishing around wood and you're fishing around rock, well, now all of a sudden that's actually a really bad option because you don't want your line to saw into the wood of the dock. You don't want your line to be so thin that it gets nicked off a rock and gets cut. So that is one right here that I'd recommend if you're talking about like basically frog fishing. You look right here. I personally don't do a lot of frog fishing. I don't throw this a lot. And then I'm going to talk about my next upgrade. So from original Power Pro, then I started to experiment with some other ones. I heard a lot about Suffix. This is the 832. This is kind of like the baseline in slightly better performing braid. So this is now with 8 fibers. So it's a little bit smoother. It's still not the smoothest. It's a little bit smoother. It's still a great price. But if you're someone who's fishing primarily braid to leader, but you're not fishing braid just because you're in cover. So you're fishing a lot of, chatterbaits, spinner baits, just open water stuff with your traditional gear. This is a great affordable line for you. It's going to be a little bit smoother than your traditional, but is still going to be very affordable and durable for you. And then if you're crazy like me and you have been fishing braid for so long, you've been trying to figure out exactly the perfect braid for you. And yes, this is a little bit expensive, but I'm going to explain to you why this is worth it. So I stumbled upon this. This is Suffix 131. So it's the same company that makes the 832, but now it's 131. So as you might be able to guess, it is 13 fibers. So it's 12 fibers on the outside and then 1 fiber down the middle. And you might be saying, this is crazy, over the top, you don't need it. You're right, you don't need it. You definitely don't need it. You could fish just traditional Power Pro and you'd be good for the rest of your life. But the reason I got into this is because I started fishing with these guys. Started fishing with my bait finesse setups a few years ago. If you guys watch the channel, you're familiar that I fish a lot of bait finesse. So this is the Corrado BFS here, and this is a little trout bait. So when I first got my BFS combo, the lightest braid that I had was 10 pounds. I think it was 10 pound Suffix 832. So I threw that on there and it was fine. It was a lot of fun. It was good. But I felt like I could go a lot lighter because once you start fishing a BFS, you realize how limber these rods are. And you're like, I don't really need that much power. You're not setting the hook with a stout, like medium light spinning rod anymore. This is a very limber rod. So I was looking around and I found the Suffix 131. I found that they had a 6 pound. And I got this. And when you see the 6 pound 131 versus even just like a 10-pound Power Pro, the difference in the texture is shockingly different, like very, very different. And the difference in the diameter is very, very different. And the reason I'm mentioning this is so then I throw it on here. And now all of a sudden, I am able to cast just from changing the line, changing nothing else, just from the line change. I was able to cast lures that were probably about a full gram lower than the ones that I was able to comfortably cast before. So literally just changing out the line, it all of a sudden opened up my range of lures that I could throw comfortably without backlashing and actually effectively throw. So that was kind of a light bulb for me. I was like, wow, this smooth and thin line really changes stuff. It really changes how the line comes off the reel, how it travels through your guides, and it allows that bait to have less friction as it is going out there, which is super important, especially for BFS, because you're doing a lot of wrist flicks. You're dealing with super light baits that any sort of friction really pulls the bait in the air. So that was where I got introduced to this. And then I thought in my head, well, if it's working for my bait finesse, I'm sure it'll work for other things. And it did. And so now on all of my rods, I throw Suffix 131 because there is a significant reduce in noise. It is very smooth and quiet when you reel it in, which is a lot of people's complaint with Braid, is that it's so loud. You don't get that as you reel it in. It's much smoother. It's extremely durable. It's very thin. Your casting distance is noticeably better. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. I didn't measure anything, but you can just feel that thing just zipping off of your reel. It's much, much better. And the other thing that's kind of, I don't really know if I can confirm this, it seems like backlashes aren't as bad with the 131 because it's so round. It literally physically looks round. Whereas a lot of braids, like traditional braids, once they get wet and used a lot, you see them that they're very flat. This is very, very round. It stays round. So when you get a backlash, they don't dig in as much. You know, sometimes how that braid backlash really will dig into the spool and it's just a nightmare. I get a lot less of that on the 131. Okay. So there's my rant on that. If you want to go high end, best of the best, for me, the best I've found is the Suffix 131 in all sizes. The only one that I find a little bit, it's a little squirrely. When you get the bigger sizes, it's a little bit weird. It doesn't lay on the spool quite right. Like I would say 40-pound and below, Suffix 131 is unbeatable if you're looking for just best casting distance, best experience, and just all around best. So, okay, we got our braid taken care of. You cannot just fish straight braid on everything for several reasons. And a lot of it might be psychological, but it is what it is. So the first reason is you don't want fish to see the braid. It's extremely unnatural for a thick, especially like a 40-pound braid with a little knot tag end tied right into some sort of a bait, especially if it's like a worm, right? If I'm fishing like a chatterbait, I'm less concerned, but you need to tie a leader. So my leader line that I use, this is Maxima Ultra Green, and I'm not going to take credit for this. I got this completely. All of this I got from Tactical Bass. That's where I get most of my information, and they are so correct on this Maxima line. This stuff is fantastic. I've tried a bunch of different line. I've tried like the Stren Original, Berkeley Big Game, all that kind of stuff. All that stuff is absolutely garbage once you switch over to an actually high quality monofilament. I feel like a lot of people just buy cheap monofilament thinking it's all the same. That was me for a long time. Once you get a little bit higher quality, not that this is that expensive, once you get a little bit higher quality, you realize how different it really is. So let's go through a couple of these different setups I use. So on my main rod, I guess you would say, on my medium heavy rod, my 4-power, right? So this is this guy. On my 4-power Dobbins is a 7'1" 4-power. I throw 40-pound Suffix 131, and then I tie it to a 15-pound Maxima Ultra Green leader, and I use an Alberto knot. So with this size of line, I'll use 7 loops down, 7 loops back, and then you cinch it with both main lines, or leader line and tag end, and then main line and other tag end, and then back through. That's what I tie for this guy. It's extremely reliable if you tie the knot correctly. So that's my main rod right here. Okay, that's what I use for all my bread and butter stuff, chatterbaits, Senkos, all that kind of stuff. Now let's take a look at my second most used rod here. This is the Dobbins Caden 610 4-power. This is a cranking rod. It is made for jerkbaits, and I use it for top waters and jerkbaits. On this, I have 30 pound suffix 131 tied to a 10 pound Maxima Ultra Green leader. And then, of course, that BFS one I showed you earlier, that is 6 pound suffix 131 tied to a 5 pound Maxima Ultra Green leader. And then I do have my last rod up here. This is a Dobbin Sierra 735. And now I don't fish with this a whole lot, but this is the Dobbin Sierra 735. This is a Daiwa Tatula. And I use 50 pound suffix 131 tied to a 20 pound Maxima Ultra Green leader. And I just use this for a little bit larger swim baits, mag drafts, burritos, stuff like that. So that is kind of, those are my rods that I use on a regular basis. That's kind of my line setup. And I tie them all with an Alberto knot. With the larger diameter lines, like the 50 pound and 40 pound, I tie 7 loops down, 7 loops back, 7 loops back on the Alberto knot. And then on the, well, and also on the 30 pound. So 30, 40, and 50 pound, I use the Alberto knot 7 loops. On the BFS combo, I had a couple issues with that Alberto knot coming loose. It was just, the line is so small that 7 loops is not enough. So now I do 9 loops down and 9 loops back just on my BFS combo. Just a couple more loops to grab the line a little bit better sometimes will help, especially with a smoother braid like the suffix 131. And now let's talk about the final piece of this, and that is leader length. All right, so this is where I make up for the lack of flexibility in braid. So the number one issue with braid is that if you're fishing a bait like a topwater that has thin little treble hooks, or you're fishing a Vision 110 that has very fine wire treble hooks, using braid is actually a big problem because those hooks are going to just bend out immediately when you apply pressure. So there's a few things that you do to counteract that, and that I would say completely counteracts that if you're careful. The first thing is leader length. So when I say leader, that doesn't mean the same length every single time. So for example, on this right here, I just had a fresh leader. This is my rod that I use for topwaters and jerkbaits. When I tie a leader to this rod, as you can see right here, the knot is right here, and it goes all the way up the rod and then back down here. So we're looking at like a, well, let's see. We're looking at like a 10-foot leader. Okay, that's a pretty significant leader. And the reason is not just because I decided to go with a super long leader. I go with the longer leader on this rod specifically because I want that monofilament to really stretch as I set the hook and I'm fighting the fish. That is a lot of give that allows the hooks not to just bend right out. If you go straight braid, those hooks are going to bend right out the second you set the hook or the fish surges. So that's the first kind of defense against that. That'd be like on like the hook set on like a surge, right? Now the other part of this is you cannot if you're fishing with a bait that has treble hooks on it, you just cannot fish it with lockdown drag. You need to have your drag playful. So a lot of times what I'll have is my drag a little bit tighter for the initial hook set because I need to bury the barbs. And then if I'm feeling the fish is actually pulling on me a little bit, I will back off the drag a little bit mid-fight to allow them to kind of pull, drag, as well as stretch the monofilament to allow the hooks to not bend out. And that is kind of how I counteract it. Now, look, I'm not going to lie and sit here and say, of course it'd be easier to fish with fluorocarbon on my jerkbait rod. But the problem is if I put fluorocarbon on this rod, then I can only throw jerkbaits on here. And now all of a sudden this topwater becomes useless because I can't throw topwaters on here. And you might say, well, you should get another rod. Well, I don't want to have, 7, 8 rods. I would like to have the same rods that I use most of the time. And if I want to switch it to a topwater, I can just switch it back over to a jerkbait. I don't want to have 7, 8 rods every time I go out on the water. So the other part about braid is that it's extremely versatile. You can adapt it to what you are doing. So general rule of thumb, finesse fishing and treble hook fishing, I go like double the length for a leader. So anywhere from 10 foot, you can even go longer if you want to, if it's super fine wire. But I go about 10 foot on your leader. Whereas on my other rod here, if we pull up this guy, so again, this rod has a chatterbait on it with a stout hook like we looked at earlier. Now this rod, I do not want the same effect. I don't want an extreme amount of stretch. I want a little bit of stretch just in case, just for a little bit of surge, but really I'm putting the leader on here for natural approach. I'm not putting it on there because I need it to stretch. Truthfully, I could tie this straight to braid, walk down my drag, set the hook and drag them in, and the hook's still not gonna bend out. So in this case, I'm not going for a long leader to provide surge protection. Instead, I'm gonna go with about I know it's gonna be impossible for you guys to see, but this is about, I don't know, 3 feet, 3.5, 4 feet. And that's just enough to provide a natural presentation where they're not going to be focused on the line. It gives me a little bit of room if I need to retie, stuff like that. But it also doesn't take away from the stoutness of the braid, so I can still get a very solid hook set when I do set that hook. So there it is, guys. There is my line setup on all my rods, kind of the reasoning for it. I know this is a very opinionated topic. If you have a totally different opinion and you want to educate me on that, please put it in the comments. I'd be very interested to hear. I'm always a work in progress. I'm always trying new things out. So for right now, this is my system. But if there's something that comes into play that I like to try out, I'm always open to try that. Thank you guys for the view. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys in the next one.